Welcome to my Shiur. This week we're going to be talking about Purim. It's on Tanis Esther today, and we're fasting. It's an interesting fast because actually the fast that we are commemorating didn't occur the day before Purim. It occurred almost a year earlier when Queen Esther went into Achashverosh to begin the process of the Geula that occurred on Purim. So it was many months earlier, and in the interim, of course, many things happened. But we fast because it's appropriate to fast on a day before we celebrate, because as you're going to see in the course of this Shiur, one of the things I'm going to be talking about is no pain, no gain. That if you don't go through some type of process of difficulty, of challenge, then you're never going to have the result, the end result, which is the positivity and the upbeat of the celebration of Purim. So today we're fasting, and in anticipation of a wonderful and celebration that we're going to have on Purim, I want to wish you all Purim Sameach. So you know that there are two festivals in the Jewish calendar cycle which are not in the Torah. So we know of the festivals that are in the Torah. We have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres, Pesach, and Shavuos. Those festivals are all mentioned in the Torah on a number of occasions, and we discuss the various aspects of those festivals in the Torah. But there's two festivals that are not mentioned in the Torah. One of them is mentioned in Megillas Esther, which we're going to be reading on Purim. The other one isn't mentioned at all in Tanakh. It's mentioned only in the Gemara. It's mentioned in the Gemara in Shabbos, and of course it's brought down to Halacha. Purim and Chanukah, those are the festivals that we're talking about. Purim actually didn't happen during the period of, as it were, the Tanakh, the Nevi'im. It happened right at the end of that period of Jewish history, in the years between the end of the first Beis HaMikdash and the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash. I can't date it precisely, it's not important. It happened during the Golus. It's a Golus festival. And so too Chanukah, in a certain way, is also a Golus festival. Why? Because there was a slight period of Golus, of, as a reduction of Jewish control over Jerusalem by the fact that the Greeks had taken control and had inserted their own effigies, their own pagan idols into the Makom HaMikdash, into the place where the Beis HaMikdash was. So it's a period, a window of Golus, even though it was during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. They're Golus festivals, that's what they are. And we have Purim and we have Chanukah. Now, according to tradition, Chanukah relates to Torah Shebaal Peh. Why? It's obvious, because it's not in Tanakh. We don't find Chanukah in Tanakh. There's no book relating to Chanukah in Nevi'im or Ksuvim, and therefore it's considered to be a festival which is a celebration of Torah Shebaal Peh. Whereas Purim is a festival which is associated with Torah Shebichtav. Why? Because it appears in Tanakh. We have Megillas Esther. We're going to read it on Purim. So we have a document as part of the Hebrew Scriptures that is part of Tanakh that is associated with Purim. So it's considered to be a festival in which I don't know how to best express it, but it is closely connected to Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah. Whereas Chanukah is Torah Shebaal Peh, which is the oral traditions, which were not written down until much later in Jewish history, during the time of the Talmud, which was after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, many hundreds of years later. Okay, the question I want to ask you is this. Surely Purim should be a festival that is associated with Torah Shebaal Peh. And listen carefully to this. The Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Peches Amud Aleph, says that God dangled, as it were, a mountain over the Jewish people. He took Har Sinai, uprooted it. I don't know exactly what this means, but you can picture it. It's a very dramatic scene. He took a mountain, he dangled it over the Jewish people, over their heads, like a lid. That's what it says. Kofu aleim har kegigis, and he threatened them. Either you accept the Torah, or this will be your grave. I'm going to read you the Gemara. The Gemara here in Peiches Amud Aleph in Maseches Shabbos. Vayisyatzvu betachtis ahar. The Torah says, the Pasuk says, Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet God, as it were, and they stood at the lowermost part of the mount. Vayisyatzvu betachtis ahar. Amar Rav Abdimi bar Choma bar Chasa. So he said as follows: Melame chekofa hakodesh baruch hu aleim es hahar kegigis. We learn from this pasuk vayisyatzvu betachtis ahar, because betachtis could also mean underneath, not just the foot of, but underneath. That God dangled the mountain above the Jews like a lid, and said to them, if you accept the Torah, makablim haTorah mutav, that's very wonderful. V'im lav shom tehei kvuraschem, you're going to get buried here. This is your grave. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, mikan moido'a rabba le'oraisa. Says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, from here there is a substantial caveat to the obligation to fill the Torah. Amar Rava. By the way, what does he mean, Rav Acha bar Yaakov? He's saying if they didn't accept it fully, if the Jewish people never accepted the Torah fully, how can you hold them responsible when they don't observe all the precepts, all the laws that are contained in the Torah? It's not fair, because they were forced to do it. In a situation where you're forced to doing something, you've got a gun to your head, there's absolutely no way you can be held responsible if later on you say, well, actually, I didn't really want to do it, but you forced me at that moment in time. Now that I'm no longer being forced, I don't want to do it. Says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, we have a perfect excuse for the Jewish people if they don't always observe Torah law, because kofu aleim har kegigis, that God dangled the mountain over their heads like a lid, and he said, you're going to get buried here if you don't accept the Torah. Well, what choice did they have? Omar Rava. So Rava responds to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, and he says as follows: Af al pi kain. Yes, that may have been the case during the period before the Purim story. However, Hodur Kiblu b'meach Hashverosh, at the time of the Purim story, they did accept the Torah willingly, not reluctantly, not under the gun, as it were. They accepted the Torah willingly. How do we know? Because Dichsiv Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim. It says there, we have this expression of Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim. Kiyamu Moshe Kiblu Kvar. They carried out what they had already accepted. That was what was going on at the time of the Megillah, and the Jewish people accepted the Torah. So there's no excuses anymore. Maybe you would have had an excuse during the time of the first Beis Hamikdash. You no longer have an excuse not to observe the Torah. Of course, Rava and Rav Acha bar Yaakov lived at the time of the Gemara, which was many hundreds of years, more than 500, 600 years after the end of the period of the Golus between the first Beis Hamikdash and the second Beis Hamikdash. If I work it out, I can't work it out exactly, but we know that the Gemara was only completed in the 4th century, and if that's the case, and we know that it was at least 500 years before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, or whatever the number is, that the story of the Purim story occurred. So it's many, many centuries later. So Rava is telling Rav Acha bar Yaakov, you're looking for a get-out clause. This is your disclaimer. Sorry, the disclaimer doesn't work. Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim, and we have it there enshrined in the words of Megillas Esther, that the Jewish people, they did a new version of Na'aseh v'Nishma, where they did it willingly. They didn't do it because somebody was threatening to kill them. So that is the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Peiches Amud Aleph. Even though the Jewish people said Na'aseh v'Nishma, the Kabbalah Satorah at Mount Sinai somehow was lacking in something, because there was an element of compulsion, of being forced, even if in the end they were going to accept it anyway. Let's say the Jewish people said, even if you wouldn't have forced us, we would have accepted it, but there was some element of Kofu Aleim Har Kegigis, and therefore it wasn't 100%. Whether it was 98% or 64% that we can debate and discuss, but it wasn't 100%. When was the Torah fully accepted? The Gemara says, Chatam Sofer, that at that moment they re-accepted the Torah, at that time willingly. They accepted it again at the time of King Achashverosh, because it says in the Megillah, Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim. Now, all the commentaries pounce on this Gemara like carnivores. And they ask the question, why did the Jewish people need to be forced? Why didn't they accept the Torah willingly? Every one of the Mefarshim deals with this question. They're very puzzled by this Gemara. And there's a number of answers, but the most prominent one of those answers is as follows. The most famous answer is the idea that the Jewish people willingly accepted Torah Shebichtav. That means the Torah that was written down in the Torah. They said whatever Hashem writes down through the medium of Moshe Rabbeinu, that we accept. They said, Naseh v'nishma. Naseh, we're going to do whatever it says in the Torah, v'nishma, and we'll listen to it later, we'll hear the explanations for whatever it is later. Whatever it says in the Torah, we shall do. But they were reluctant to accept the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral traditions that accompanied the Torah. Whether that means halacha l'Moshe Sinai, or whether it means all the different methods that we have to interpret the Torah, that's not clear. But Torah Shebaal Peh, whatever that may mean, and we're going to look a little bit more at Torah Shebaal Peh during the course of this shiur, whatever it means that there is an oral Torah, was something that they weren't willing to just accept blindly. Obviously, what the Torah says and what Hashem writes and what Moshe Rabbeinu tells us that these are Hashem's words, that we're willing to accept. Torah Shebaal Peh, we're a little bit more reluctant. So God threatened them. He said, no, this is a package deal. You have to accept the Torah Shebaal Peh with the Torah Shebichtav. One without the other doesn't work, and therefore they accepted it. Why? Out of fear of annihilation. If you look at the Pnei Yeshua, that's the explanation. I mean, he puts it together beautifully, but there's many other sources that you can look at that give this idea that the original accepting of the Torah, the Naseh v'nishma, was wholehearted and complete when it came to Torah Shebichtav, but it was lacking when it came to Torah Shebaal Peh, and therefore God threatened the Jewish people, after which they accepted it. If what reluctantly may have said they would have accepted it anyway if it would have been explained to them, but much later on during the story of Purim, Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim, Torah Shebaal Peh, they accepted unquestioningly and they were happy to have it. Which surely means, and this is why I brought this Gemara into the shiur, it surely means that Purim is most closely associated with Torah Shebaal Peh, right? Because if you think about it, if the entire concept of Purim is Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim, that's what the Gemara says in Maseches Shabbos, that they accepted Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim, they accepted Torah Shebaal Peh, which they had not accepted at Ma'amad Har Sinai, then surely Purim should be a festival of Torah Shebaal Peh. Okay, it's in Torah Shebichtav, it's in Tanakh, so what? But we see the Gemara is very explicit, that it discusses the fact that Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim is talking about Torah Shebaal Peh, that the Naseh v'nishma was Torah Shebichtav, and Purim was a Naseh v'nishma on Torah Shebaal Peh. So why is Chanukah considered the Yom Tov of Torah Shebaal Peh, and Purim considered the festival of Torah Shebichtav? It's a good question. That's what we're going to address today in the shiur. Now, I want to ask you another question. It's unrelated, but you're going to see it's related. What's the halacha? What would be the halacha if Purim falls on Shabbos? Now you're going to say to me, it can't happen because you live in Chutz La'aretz. I mean, obviously I have viewers and listeners who live in Eretz Yisrael, but those of you who live in Chutz La'aretz, you're going to say to me, it's not possible because our 19-year cycle, it's a preset cycle, it's calibrated in such a way that Purim and Chutz La'aretz can never happen on Shabbos. But that's not true in Eretz Yisrael, because Purim, if you live in Yerushalayim, is on Shushan Purim. And if Purim for everywhere else falls on Friday, that means Purim can fall on Shabbos. Okay, so we do have situations where Purim can fall on Shabbos. By the way, before there was a 19-year preset cycle, and we went according to when the witnesses saw the new moon, it was perfectly possible for Purim to occur on a Shabbos. Why? Because it's just the way it is. Even now, when we look at our calendar, occasionally we see that the Moiled doesn't quite match up with Rosh Chodesh, and we know that the 19-year cycle is almost precise, but not quite precise. And if you know anything about lunar cycles, you'll know that occasionally Rosh Chodesh falls not on Rosh Chodesh, and it could it's perfectly possible for it to happen that Purim would fall on Shabbos. Okay, now what are the halachas? The Megillah can't be read on Shabbos. Why? Shemo Yavirenu. Because you might find a mistake in the Megillah, and you're going to carry it, and there's not going to be an Eruv. You're going to carry it to a Mumcha, you're going to carry it to a Sofer, because you're going to want to know if the Megillah that you're going to read from is kosher, and you're going to carry it in the street on Shabbos. Therefore, Chazal made a takana that you're not allowed to read Megillah on Shabbos. So when do you read the Megillah? You read it on Friday. That's when you read the Megillah. You push it back by one day, which makes perfect sense, because especially now where the only way it can happen is for Purim to fall on the 15th of Adar, on Shushan Purim in Yerushalayim. You can't read Megillah on the 16th. That's not one of the dates that's brought in the Mishnah in Megillah. But you, of course, can read it on the 14th, because that's going to be Purim. It's going to be Purim for everywhere. So you read the Megillah on the 14th of Adar. You don't read it on Shabbos. Okay. By the way, you do say Al Hanissim, and you say Bimei Mordechai Ve'Esteh, that you do say on Shabbos. What about the Seudah? Seudas Purim. When should you have Seudas Purim? The Gemara actually doesn't go into it. But the Rishonim say that you can't do Seudas Purim on Shabbos. Why not? Because the Seudah that you have on Shabbos cannot be eclipsed by the Seudah that you would do for Purim. And because Purim is the day that you're really focused on, if it's Purim, if you do Seudas Purim on Shabbos, somehow that's going to take away from the holiness, the sanctity of Shabbos. Therefore, I guess Rishonim, I don't want to call it takana or gzeira, but they said the halacha is you don't do the Seudas Purim on Shabbos. So when do you do it? You push it off. You do what's called a tashlumin Seudah. It's the same as if you would, and this of course is brought in the halacha by Chazal, that if, let's say, you missed Shachris, you missed the tefillah, the Shemona Esrei of Shachris, what do? You have a tefillah Shemona Esrei that you can make up for Shachris in Mincha. You daven Mincha, and then after you finish Mincha, you do a second Shemona Esrei. It's called Tashlumin, and you make up for the fact that you missed the Shemona Esrei of Shachris. You say a second Amidah, and then you can make up for it. You have a similar situation with Seudas Purim. You couldn't do the Seudah on Shabbos for the reasons that I've mentioned, but you still have to do Seudas Purim. So you have a Tashlumin Seudah that you're going to do after Purim is over, after Shabbos is over. You're going to do it on Sunday. Now here's the question. Here's the shaila for you. So you have to put your rabbinic hat on. When do you do Seudas Purim if you couldn't do it on Shabbos and now you have to do it on Sunday? When do you do it? Do you do it in the night, immediately after Shabbos is over? After Shabbos you make a Melava Malka, and that Melava Malka is Seudas Purim. Or do you wait until the day? So, the fact is that all the mitzvahs of Purim have to be done during the daytime. That's the, by the way, we're going to read Megillah. We're going to read Megillah in the night, but we read it again in the morning. Why do we read it again in the morning? Because you read the Megillah in the night to acknowledge the nace of Purim, but it's not sufficient, because all the mitzvahs of Purim have to be done by Yom. You give shlachmanos, you give matanos le'evyonim, and you have a seudah. You have to have it during the day. So Megillah is also in the day. In fact, the nace is celebrated in the day, and there's an association of the day. All the mitzvahs are done in the day, so the Megillah of the night is not sufficient. The same is true of the Seudah. You don't have the Seudah of Purim at night. Of course, you could eat at night, but that's not when we have it. We have the Seudah in the daytime. So, what if you missed the day of Purim? Why? Because Purim was on Shabbos. So Purim was on Shabbos, and you didn't do the Seudah. So now when do you do it? Normally, we do the Seudas Purim in the daytime. But what about if it's no longer Purim? It's a tashlumin Seudah. It's a make-up for something that you missed on Purim. Do you still have to do it in the day? Or can you do it at night because it's a tashlumin and therefore it's not relevant to do it on the day because it's nothing to do with about this association of the mitzvahs. It's a machlokas. It's a debate between two very great rabbinic figures of the modern era. One of them is the Meshech Chochmah, Rabbi Meir Simcha HaCohen of Dvinsk, and the other one is the Chatam Sofer. Chatam Sofer lived roughly 100 years before the Meshech Chochmah, but it's an incredible debate between these two giants of Jewish learning, the Meshech Chochmah and the Chatam Sofer. Rabbi Meir Simcha says in Meshech Chochmah that you can eat the Seudah Purim on Saturday night, on Motzei Shabbos, and actually, he says as follows, he says it might be preferable. It's probably better to eat the Seudah at night than to eat it during the day. If you're eating the Seudah on Purim, of course you have to eat it during the day for the reasons I specified a moment ago. But if you couldn't eat it on Purim, and this is a make-up Seudah, the daytime only rule no longer applies. Why? Because it's nothing to do with the mitzvah hayom, and it makes more sense to eat the Seudah at night and not to push it off until the following day, because Rizim Makdimim, now you have the opportunity to eat the Seudah. It's the make-up Seudah for the Seudah you missed. Do it sooner rather than later. That's the opinion of the Meshech Chochmah. But the Chatam Sofer, in his Sefer of Droshos, this Drosha was from Parashat Zochar in 1832, he says as follows, he says differently. In his opinion, the halacha is that you always have to have the Purim Seudah in the day, during the day. Even if it's a day after Purim, and Purim is on Shabbos, so you're doing the Tashlumin Seudah, you have to do it in the day. You can't say that because it's not a Shabbos and it's only a Tashlumin that I'm going to do it in the night. In fact, he uses this particular idea to learn Pshat in a Gemara, the Gemara from which we derive this halacha that the Purim Seudah has to be in the daytime. I want to read this Gemara to you. It's fascinating, and his interpretation of this Gemara is enlightening. It's beautiful. This is a Gemara in Megillah, Maseches Megillah, Daf Zayin Amud Beis. You should look it up, and I'm going to read it to you here, and you'll have the source sheet which you can look at after. You can click on the link, and you'll be able to see the source link. Omar Rava. Rava says, Seudas Purim she'achola balayla lo yotza. If you ate Seudas Purim at night, you didn't discharge your duty. Lo yotza yadei chayvasei. My timer. What's the reason, says Rava, for this halacha? Because the Megillah actually says, the words of the Megillah include Yemei Mishta v'Simcha. The word Yemei is days. Yemei Mishta v'Simcha, talking about the days of Purim, talking about Purim and Shushan Purim. They were daytime events, they weren't nighttime events, and therefore you have to have the festive meal of Purim in the daytime, not at night. That's the source of the halacha that you must eat the Seudah during the day. The Gemara then tells a story. It's a fascinating story. Listen to this amazing story recorded in Megillah Daf Zayin Amud Beis. Rav Ashi have a Yosef Kamed Rav Kahana. Rav Ashi, he was a rabbi, great rabbi. In fact, he was one of the editors, the final editors of the Gemara that we have. Everything that we have in Talmud Bavli, he was one of the editors. It was Ravina and Rav Ashi. His Rebbe was Rav Kahana. And he was once sitting in the Beis Medrash of Rav Kahana, Nega velo asura bonon. And it was Purim, and nobody came. None of the students of the Beis Medrash arrived in the Beis HaMedrash. It's Purim afternoon, no one's there. Amale, my time lo asura bonon. So Rav Ashi says to his Rebbe, Rav Kahana, why is nobody coming today? Why is the Beis HaMedrash empty? Dilma trida bisudas Purim. So Rav Kahana answered him, he said, perhaps they're very busy with Seudas Purim, that's why they're not coming to the Beis Medrash to learn. That's why it's just you and me here today, we're on our own. All right, that's what he answered him. So Rav Ashi responded, Amar le v'lahava efsha lemeichla be'urta. Says Rav Ashi to Rav Kahana, he says, really? They're busy with Seudas Purim? What a poor excuse. Surely they could have had Seudas Purim last night. Amalei lo shmi'a le lemaha de Omar Rava Sudas Purim sha'chola balayla yotze de chavosei. So Rav Kahana looked at him, perplexed, surprised. He says, Rav Ashi, my dear friend, didn't you hear what Rava said? That somebody who has Sudas Purim at night hasn't fulfilled their task, that hasn't discharged their duty? What are you talking about? Why would you suggest that they could have had their Seudah last night and they're a bunch of batlonim? They're lazy because they don't come to the base of Medrash during the day because they're busy with the Purim Seudah. They could have had it last night. No, they couldn't have had it last night because last night you couldn't be Yotzeh the Seudah of Sudas Purim. So what are you saying? That's what Rav Kahana responded to Rav Ashi. Amalei, Amar Rava Hochi. So Rav Ashi looked at Rav Kahana in complete shock. He says to him, really? That's what Rava said? I never knew that. Amalei in. So Rav Kahana looked at him and said, yes, actually, that's exactly what Rava said. And what happened then is even more amazing. Tanomine arba'in zimnin. He learnt this halacha over, he repeated it to himself 40 times. V'domile commander manach bekisei, so that he should, as it were, stick it into his wallet. That it should be so firmly embedded into his head that he would never forget this halacha again. That's the story. Says the Chatam Sofer. The Gemara seems to imply that Rav Ashi didn't know the halacha, that you can't have the Seudah in the night, you can only have it in the day. The Chatam Sofer says, really? How's that even possible? Rav Ashi, the great Rav Ashi, a Talmud Chacham, one of the greatest rabbis of his generation. Okay, at this stage he's still only a Talmud of Rav Kahana, but so what? This great rabbi, this knowledgeable person, wouldn't know this basic halacha? That you can't have Sudas Purim at night, you have to wait until the day? He'd never heard it before. It makes no sense that Rav Ashi had never heard this halacha before. So the Chatam Sofer explains that the Gemara is not talking about an ordinary Purim. Do you know what this story is talking about? It's talking about a Purim that occurred on Shabbos, and the Seudah had to be pushed off. Rav Ashi thought that in such a situation, you could have the Seudah at night, because it's not a normal Purim, it's a Tashlumin Seudah. It's just a make-up Seudah for the one that you missed on Purim, because you can't have Sudas Purim on Shabbos, and you don't have to wait until the day. So Rav Kahana taught him a new halacha. Do you know what the halacha is? That Rava says that even a nidche Seudah, even a tashlumin Seudah, has to be eaten during the day. We have a difference of opinion between the Meshech Chochmah and the Chatam Sofer. Rabbi Meir Simcha, the Meshech Chochmah, seems to be saying that the main chiyuv for all the mitzvahs of Purim is in the daytime, not night. But that only applies if it's actually Purim. If it isn't Purim, it's just a make-up Seudah, because you didn't do Seudah on Shabbos, and now it's Motzei Shabbos Sunday. Who cares if it's in the day or the night? It's not relevant, because no longer Purim. That was a mitzvah or halacha that's only relevant to Purim. Now it's not Purim, it's a make-up. You can do it at night. In fact, the sooner you do it, the better. But the Chatam Sofer has a different opinion. He believes that there is a specific requirement for the Seudah, that it has to be during the day, whether or not it's Purim. In fact, it's not important if it's Purim. The mitzvah of the Seudah is during the day. It can't be done at night, even if it's a Motzei Shabbos Sunday, nidche tashlumin Seudah. Now, why does the Chatam Sofer insist that the Seudah has to be in the day? Let's look at another drosha of the Chatam Sofer, this one from Purim in 1836. The Chatam Sofer brings up the halacha that Sudas Purim on Purim has to be in the day. That's what we've been talking about. It's this Gemara in Megillah Daf Zayin Amud Beis. And that the Beis Yosef actually said, this is fascinating. The Beis Yosef says, you're not allowed to eat meat to break the fast after Tanis Esther. You're not allowed to have a meat meal. Why? Because then people might think, oh, this is Sudas Purim, and then they won't be makpid, they won't be fussy about having a proper Seudah during the day on Purim itself, on Purim day. That's the halacha that the Beis Yosef brings down. The Chatam Sofer quotes an interesting chazal. Listen carefully, it's fascinating. When Moshe Rabbeinu was on Har Sinai, Moses was receiving the Torah from God, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How did he know if it was day or night? He was in this cloud. He was in heaven. He was communing with God. How did he know if it was day or night? Say Chazal, it's in Perikei de Rabbi Eliezer. It says as follows. When it was Torah Shebichtav, it was daytime. When he was learning Torah Shebichtav with Hashem, then it was daytime. When it was Torah Shebaal Peh, then he knew it was nighttime. And actually, Chazal add that the best time for learning Torah Shebichtav is during the day. And the best time for learning Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, which is the support structure for the Torah, that's at night time. And if you look at Rekanati, Rabbi Menachem ben Binyamin Rekanati, who's a 13th century Italian Kabbalist, he says as follows, he sets it out very, very clearly. V'da ki tzarich odom lis'asek b'Torah shebichsav bayoim, u'v'Torah shebaal peh balayla. It is imperative for a person to focus mainly on Torah shebichsav during the day and to do his Torah shebaal peh at night. It's an interesting idea, and we need to kind of unpack it. I'm not going to unpack it completely today, but I'm going to give you an idea, something for you to think about. Therefore, because the major aspect of Purim was Kabbalas HaTorah Shebaal Peh, right? Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim. We're talking about Baal Peh. One should eat the Seudah specifically at night. It would make most sense if it's true to say the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law, which gives all the details that we need in order to understand Torah Shebichsav, the written law, the Torah. If the main time for the study of that Torah is at night, when should we eat Seudas Purim? It's obvious, we have to eat it at night. That's when it should be. Why? It's Torah Shebaal Peh time. So why don't we eat the Seudas Purim at night time? This is the Chatam Sofer. It's brilliant. The Chatam Sofer explains that it would make no sense to eat the Torah Shebaal Peh Purim Seudah at night. Do you know why? Because if that was the thought process, it would amount to a fundamental error. It would mean that you really didn't understand what Torah Shebaal Peh is all about. Purim is not just about Torah Shebaal Peh. Of course not. On its own, Torah Shebaal Peh has no value, because Torah Shebichsav only works with Torah Shebaal Peh, and Torah Shebaal Peh only works with Torah Shebichsav. They are two halves of the same piece. They come together as one. Without each other, they have no value. Torah Shebichsav on its own cannot really have meaning, because it doesn't have Torah Shebaal Peh. But you can't have Torah Shebaal Peh on its own, because it means you've discarded Torah Shebichsav, that somehow you've got a new Torah, called Torah Shebaal Peh, but Torah Shebichsav is not important. We revere Torah Shebichsav, the written Torah, but we know that without Torah Shebaal Peh, it cannot be understood. We eat the Seudah during the day to demonstrate that by accepting Torah Shebaal Peh, Kiyamu Kiblu HaYehudim on Purim, not only were we accepting Torah Shebaal Peh, but we were also finally accepting Torah Shebichsav properly. Because there is no shleimus, it cannot be complete. The Torah Shebichsav is never going to be what it's meant to be without Torah Shebaal Peh. It's impossible. With this chiddush of the Chatam Sofer, and it's brilliant, with this chiddush of the Chatam Sofer, we can understand why in the other drosha and in his Psak LaHalacha, the Chatam Sofer is so insistent that even on Sunday, after a Shabbos Purim, the Seudah has to be during the day, not on Motzei Shabbos. It doesn't have to do with Yom Purim. That's Meshech Chochma's idea, that it's to do with the mitzvahs hayom, and if that's no longer relevant, then you can do it at night time. No, it's got nothing to do with that. It has to do with the symbolic connection between Torah Shebichsav and Torah Shebaal Peh. Because the Simcha is not just about Torah Shebaal Peh on its own, in a solitary way. It's completely combined. In fact, it underpins Torah Shebichtav. There are two reasons why people find it hard to study Torah Shebaal Peh, which is mainly through the Gemara, Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, but even Midrashim. People find it very difficult to study Torah Shebaal Peh, whereas they don't find it difficult to study Torah Shebichtav. People read Psukim in Torah, they read it in Nevi'im, they read it in Ksuvim. The first reason it's simpler. There are no hard concepts in Torah Shebichtav. I'm talking about, of course, behind the stories and behind what it says, there are hard concepts, but it's basic facts, it's information. It's not difficult. There's no detailed arguments or points of view. There's no Tosfos, there's no Ritva, there's no Rashba, there's no Rishonim, no Achronim. You can just read. Of course, there are commentaries on Torah, but you can read through the Torah and it makes perfect sense. It doesn't tax your brain. Torah Shebaal Peh, however, requires hard work. If you really want to do it properly, you've got to go through it line by line. You've got to make sure that you understand every word in each line, and sometimes there's multiple ways of understanding each line, and each concept can relate to many other concepts that are contained elsewhere in the Gemara, and it's a function of Rashi and Tosfos to guide us, and then we go further into Rishonim and Achronim, and in all kinds of ways we draw out more and more meaning from the Gemara. It's mayim she'ein lehem soif. It's water that has no edge. It goes on forever. And people, when it comes to that level of learning, that level of investment in intellectual pursuit, they can't be bothered exerting themselves. It's too much. It's too much pressure. Much easier to read the Parsha of the week. That's what they do. Now, that's the first reason why people tend not to look at Torah Shebaal Peh as much as they do Torah Shebichtav. A second reason is this. People don't see why all the details of Torah Shebaal Peh are relevant, why they're even relevant to them. They don't see it. In fact, for many people, this is interesting, the study of Torah Shebaal Peh has become very similar to their study of Torah Shebichtav. They read through it quickly, right? Think about it. I'm not going to say anything bad, and I would like to encourage anyone who's listening to this share, watching this share, they should study as much Gemara as they can, and hopefully they'll be able to delve more into it as time goes by. But isn't it interesting that the study of Torah Shebaal Peh has taken on this Torah Shebichtav type of behavior? If they find something a little challenging, if somebody's reading through a Gemara and finds it a little challenging, well, he'll skim over it or skip it and go to the next piece. You know, the point is just finishing the piece. It's not that I have to put effort into it to understand it. I can't always understand the concept. It's complicated. It's remote. It's something that I don't find relevant to my life. It's not relevant to me. I don't need to understand it in every level of detail. That's a Torah Shebichtav way of looking at it. It's not relevant, right? The detail's not relevant. I just need to read through it and that's going to be enough. But the reality is totally different. A true Torah life is full of complexities. It's full of challenges. It's full of contradictions, and it's never, or it shouldn't be, superficial or shallow. And it is these two reasons, the first being that people find it hard to learn Torah Shebaal Peh, and the second, that people find it irrelevant to them and therefore can't be bothered with it. Those are the two reasons. Those are the two reasons which are the background to the celebration of the two festivals that we have that are, as it were, not in the Torah, even though one of them is in Torah Shebichtav in terms of Tanakh. They are Golus festivals, Chanukah and Purim. Those two reasons underpin those two Chagim. What was the challenge to the Jewish people at the time of Chanukah? Hisrashlut. You know what that means? It's a level of negligence, apathy, like disinterest. We don't want to get involved. The Jewish people were not ready to take risks, and they were not ready to put themselves in challenging situations for their Judaism. How did the Chashmonaim, the Maccabees, how did Matisyahu Kohen Gadol, the Kohanim, who took a stand, how did they change that? By being Moshe Nefesh. The other side, the flip side of that coin is to be Moshe Nefesh, to take risks, to be willing to take on challenges, to counteract the apathy that had taken a hold of Jewish life. That's what had happened. The Chashmonaim were the opposite. They were reverse of that. And that's the essence of Torah Shebaal Peh, that first reason of Torah Shebaal Peh, to be Moshe Nefesh, not to just give up and say, I can't be bothered. It's too hard for me. I don't want to do it. No pain. Remember I said that at the beginning? No gain. Without effort, without investment, intellectual investment, there's no such thing as Torah Shebaal Peh. The Chashmonaim brought back the essence of Torah Shebaal Peh to Klal Yisrael, to the Jewish people. Now, at the beginning of the Purim story, Jews, the Jewish people, saw no reason why they couldn't enjoy a festive meal with Achashverosh. He was celebrating his kingdom. They thought, we can also celebrate with him, and we can still be good Jews. There was no law against that in the Torah. They looked through their Torah, their superficial understanding of the Torah. Then it's not a problem. I mean, obviously, we're not going to eat anything treif, but what's the problem? They couldn't understand why Mordechai was so fanatical. Don't go to the Seudah of Achashverosh. Why not? What's wrong with it? They thought he was a complete fanatic in every aspect of his Judaism. I can be relaxed about my Judaism. I don't have to worry so much. I don't have to go into such detail. I looked in the Torah, it seems okay. But Mordechai was the definition of Torah Shebaal Peh. A Torah Shebaal Peh that gives meaning to Torah Shebichtav. Everything is relevant. There's details that you don't know if you have a superficial reading. That's Mordechai. After the miracle occurred, the Jews suddenly realized, the Jews of Persia, in Paras Umodai, they realized that what they thought they knew, they didn't know at all. Their Torah Shebichtav was lacking. They didn't have it. It was shallow, and ultimately it was leading them down the wrong path. They were heading towards oblivion. Once the miracle happened, they saw that only Mordechai's way gave Torah Shebichtav any real meaning. That is the Yom Tov of Purim. LeYehudim hoysa oira zu Torah. Torah is the essence of Purim. On Chanukah, we celebrate the Mesiras Nefesh, the sacrifice that people are willing to make for Torah Shebaal Peh. But on Purim, we celebrate Torah Shebichtav, because Torah Shebichtav has no value without Torah Shebaal Peh. I wish you all a Purim Sameach. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you or being with you to learn more Torah next week. Thank you.